Namaskar, this is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. Donald Trump faces 34 charges. From former president, he's now a defendant. He has many infamous firsts to his name, but this is a serious legal battle. Can he survive it? More importantly, can he weaponize it to win sympathy ahead of the next presidential election? He says this is election interference. We'll discuss. French President Macron is in China today, trying to forge a middle path, trying to not get caught up in the US-China battle, but betraying Europe's confusion over China. Meanwhile, India is turning to Africa, tapping into the big arms bazaar there. Indian defense supplies are finding many takers in Africa. We'll tell you about the latest win in Made in India in defense. In West Asia, sports is the new money spinner. Some numbers put this trend in perspective. Taiwan's president is landing in the US tonight and holding meetings despite China's warnings. We'll talk about all of this and more. The headlines first. After nearly 8 years, Iran names an ambassador to the United Arab Emirates. This move signals a thaw in ties between the Gulf states. It comes after Iran and Saudi Arabia announced restoration of diplomatic ties last month. Former Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon's husband has been arrested. Peter Murrell has been held in a probe into the Scottish National Party's finances. This case relates to funds raised by the party to hold a second independence referendum. Sturgeon's husband is the former chief executive of the SNP. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky visits Poland. The neighboring country is one of Kiev's closest allies. Poland has been urging NATO members to increase military supplies to Ukraine. It has also accepted more than 1 million refugees from Ukraine. Foxconn's billionaire founder will run for Taiwan's presidency again. Terry Gu says he's running to quote-unquote avoid a war with China. He stepped down as Foxconn's chief in 2019. Taiwan will elect its next leader in January 2024. Japan battles its worst ever bird flu outbreak as egg prices soar. More than 17 million birds have been killed in just this season. The situation is so grim that Japan is running out of space to bury the dead chickens. And Germany steps up surveillance on Apple for possible abuse of its market position. Its antitrust watchdog opens the door for future curbs on the tech giant. Amazon, Alphabet and Meta are already under close scrutiny in Germany. "34. That's the number of charges against Donald Trump. Not one, not two, but 34. For the former president, America is now a nation in decline and a third world country.
I never thought anything like this could happen in America. Never thought it could happen. Incredibly, we are now a failing nation. We are a nation in decline."
Trump took to social media too. On his app, Truth Social, he said, and I'm quoting, "This seems so surreal. Wow, they're going to arrest me. Can't believe this is happening in America." And this is what he was talking about. It's one for the history books. This is the moment when Donald Trump was charged. The first time in American history a former president was slapped with criminal charges. This is Donald Trump sitting before a judge inside a criminal court with his legal team. And it was a strange day for him. He was at the center of attention again, but not in the way that he's used to. Moments before this picture was taken, Donald Trump appeared before a district attorney. He was arrested, his fingerprints were taken, and he was produced before a judge. Then Trump was allowed to go home. But this is just the beginning of his legal troubles. What's happening in America is truly unprecedented. For the first time, a former president has been arrested. He's facing criminal charges. Donald Trump, of course, says he's not guilty. His case will begin soon, and these hearings will test America's democracy. Next year, the US will pick its next president. There is a presidential election, and the case against Donald Trump could define that race. Will he gain support from this legal scrutiny? Or will this case push Donald Trump into political oblivion? It's hard to say, really. But here are the facts of the case, starting with the charges against Trump. Technically, there are 34 charges, but fundamentally, this case has been built on two pillars. Donald Trump is accused of orchestrating a hush money scheme. It paved the way for his presidency. And once Trump was inside the White House, he tried to cover up the scheme. What is the basis of these charges? Donald Trump apparently had an affair with a porn star called Stormy Daniels in 2006. In 2016, Trump made payments to her, a total of $130,000. And what was this payment for? To remain silent. Apparently, Daniels wanted to speak out. She wanted to sell her story to the media, but Trump's lawyer intervened. His name is Michael Cohen. He was Trump's lawyer then. And he paid Stormy Daniels $130,000. She was asked to keep quiet, and she did. 12 days later, Trump won the 2016 election. And all these years later, the hush money payment has landed him in trouble. Trump is accused of falsifying his business records. He reimbursed Cohen for the $130,000 payment. But in his own account books, Donald Trump showed this as legal fee. And that's a lie. And that is why there's a case against him today. Here's how the prosecutor described the case against Donald Trump.
Everyone stands equal before the law. No amount of money and no amount of power changes that enduring American principle. The defendant repeatedly made false statements no matter who you are. We cannot and will not normalize serious criminal conduct.
So what happens next? The proceedings will be a long, drawn-out process. When is the next hearing? 4th of December. It's still far away. The trial will begin in January 2024. It could extend well into the presidential election in the US, and it could go on well beyond that election too. And what happens if Trump is found guilty? At this point, it could go anywhere. Donald Trump could face a fine, or he could go to prison. The maximum prison sentence in such cases is 4 years. But will that stop Trump from running in 2024? Not at all. Even if Trump, as president, goes to jail, the law allows him to run the government from behind bars. That is, of course, if Trump becomes president again. So guilty or not guilty, he can contest the election and he can remain in public office. Which brings us to the next question. Can he win this election? How will this case impact his chances? Will he still have a mass following in the US? As of today, Donald Trump's core supporter base looks intact. They are behind him. Yesterday, he tried to provoke them by painting himself as a political martyr. He says the charges against him amount to election interference.
Our elections were like those of a third world country. And now this massive election interference at a scale never seen before in our country. They attacked me with an onslaught of fraudulent investigations. Russia, Russia, Russia. Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. Impeachment hoax number 1. Impeachment hoax number 2. The illegal and unconstitutional raid on Mar-a-Lago right here.
As president, Donald Trump survived 2 impeachments, and that too was a first for any US president. Now he's been charged. Can he win this legal battle? Donald Trump is banking on his supporters to ride this storm. And speaking of storms, France is in the middle of one. There's been a wave of protests. This is what France has looked like for weeks now. People are angry with the French president. And where is the president? He landed in China today. Beijing has rolled out a red carpet for President Emmanuel Macron. And the timing is worth noting. His own country is burning over pension reform. And his top ally, the US, is at odds with China. And that's putting it mildly. Their relations have hit rock bottom. But Macron does not want to get caught up in this. He wants Europe to take the middle path. And he's leading the way. And this betrays Europe's confusion vis-a-vis China. They want to run with the hares and hunt with the hounds. They want to ban Chinese app TikTok, but they want to take business delegations to Beijing. They talk about decoupling with China. They want to reduce dependence on China for critical raw materials like lithium, but they also want to engage with China. European leaders are making a beeline for Beijing. It began last year when China reopened its doors to the world. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was the first one to go. Last week, Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez was in Beijing. And this week, French President Emmanuel Macron is there. With him is the EU chief, Ursula von der Leyen. And Beijing is making a clear distinction between the two. China says Macron is on a state visit on China's invitation, while von der Leyen is merely visiting. But what are they doing there? You could say Europe is suffering from a case of FOMO, the fear of missing out. They want to shun China, but they also want China, and the war in Ukraine has given them an excuse. This is China's smokescreen of mediation. Xi Jinping wants to broker peace. Last month, he went to Russia and presented a peace plan. Putin liked it, but as expected, the West trashed it.
Of course, we did not ignore the situation around Ukraine. We believe that many of the provisions of the peace plan put forward by China are consonant with Russian approaches and can be taken as the basis for a peaceful settlement when they are ready for that in the West and in Kiev.
So the peace plan was China's bait, and Europe happily took it. For months, the Europe-China relationship has been in a deep freeze. That's because China was backing Russia in the war. So Europe cut engagement, but now it wants to talk, and the peace plan is a good place to start, also a good alibi. So European leaders are rushing to China. They want to weigh in on Xi Jinping's peace plan. They want to make it look like a noble mission to pursue peace for Ukraine and not really about business deals for their countries. Last week, Spain's Prime Minister made an appeal.
He insistido en la importancia de que Ucrania
I have also encouraged President Xi to have a conversation with President Zelensky to learn firsthand about the peace plan of the Ukrainian government.
He is encouraging Xi Jinping to talk to Zelensky. Expect Macron and von der Leyen to say the same. Do they really think China can deliver peace? Well, they do. But in typical European fashion, they've decided China can only be a facilitator and not a mediator. Listen to this.
It is clear that China should use its great influence on Putin to speed up the diplomatic negotiation. China cannot be a mediator because it's on one side, but it can be a facilitator.
Not a mediator, but a facilitator. Brussels has assigned a role for Beijing. And it's using this to engage with China. Leading the effort, like I said, is Emmanuel Macron. He wants to define Europe's China policy. He says Europe should not have to pick a side. If the US and China are fighting, Europe should be able to walk the middle path. And Macron has been making this pitch for a while. Last year he said, we need a single world order.
La Chine a réaffirmé son attachement.
China, precisely, has proposed a peace plan. We welcomed it. But do we agree on all of it? No. Nevertheless, it proves a will to engage in the resolution of the conflict.
Un chemin de paix. Et la Chine, justement, a proposé un plan de paix.
But for any of this to materialize, he must first bridge the divides within the European Union. There are leaders who do not agree with Macron's approach. Like Lithuania's foreign minister, he says France should proceed with caution. In fact, let me quote from his statement. This is what he said. We should remember that attempts to contain Russia by offering economic partnership failed. Putin was in fact emboldened by our flexibility, not persuaded. Similar tactics would also embolden China. He has a point. But the West, including the US, for the longest time has made this mistake. They see China as part of the solution rather than the problem. They're attracted by the business, and they lose sight of the strategic challenges. The US woke up to this only recently. Europe is still sitting on the fence.
It is clear that our relations have become more distant and more difficult in the last few years. We've seen a very deliberate hardening of China's overall strategic posture for some time.
We're waiting to see what Xi says on Chinese soil and what Macron says and does. He doesn't want to make a choice, but when you're an American ally and a junior partner, not making a choice is often not a choice. Also, it's worth tracking China's response. Talking to Europe will help Xi Jinping. He's been increasingly isolated and slammed for his policies. This visit, or visits like these, may change some of it. In the UK, the Home Secretary is in the headlines. Suella Braverman is in the eye of the storm again. She's taking on British Pakistani men. She blames them for child sexual abuse. She says they're quote-unquote overwhelmingly behind such cases. This is about organized groups, also called grooming gangs. Braverman says men of Pakistani origin are involved in these crimes and that authorities willfully ignore this. You may ask why. She says it's because they're trying to be politically correct. That's what the Home Secretary says. She says that law enforcement agencies are being politically correct. They take a softer approach to minorities like Muslims. And a Home Secretary is the UK's version of Home Minister. She says the police is soft because they don't want to be called bigots. Now that's a lot to unpack. And not the first time it has been said in the UK that law enforcement agencies overcompensate because they don't want to be called racist. Let me give you some context. Grooming gangs are an old issue in the UK. The theory is this: gangs of British Pakistani men roam about abducting and abusing minor white girls. There have been some very high-profile cases, like cases in Rochdale, Oxford and Telford. And British Pakistani men were involved in these cases, but they weren't the only ones. Braverman's own ministry investigated this. The UK Home Ministry released a report in 2020 and it found, and I'm quoting, group-based offenders are most commonly white. So Braverman is being slammed. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has come to her defense. His official spokesperson has made a statement. He said that British Pakistanis were linked to some grooming gangs and that this was the problem she was trying to highlight. The spokesperson then doubled down on the problem of political correctness. He said it should not hold people back from taking appropriate action. And this is the second time this year that political correctness is in the crosshairs. It came up earlier with the Prevent report. Now, what's that? What is the Prevent report? The UK has a program called Prevent. It's basically to prevent radicalization. Citizens are urged to keep an eye out for signs of radicalization, and if they find any suspicious activity, they should report it. This is the Prevent program. It came under scrutiny recently because the UK saw a lot of high-profile extremist attacks. In 2021, for instance, an MP was killed. His name was Sir David Ames. And he was killed by a man who had been flagged off to Prevent. So people wanted to know if this program was actually working. Was it of any use? The government appointed a reviewer to assess it. And the review report came out in February. It slammed the program. The report said it was only funding generic community projects. It was not focusing on religious extremism. 8 out of 10 plot investigations in the UK were linked to radical Islam. But Prevent, the government program, was failing to prevent them. Because there was, quote-unquote, a culture of timidity when it came to tackling radical Islam. All this begs the question, is political correctness really stopping law enforcement? And in the case of the UK, it seems a bit contradictory because a lot of reports say law enforcement in the UK also has a racial bias. So maybe this political correctness is an overcompensation for years of racist policing. And that too is problematic. You see, no country can afford to go soft on heinous crimes like child sexual abuse or radicalization. In an ideal world, there should be no biases. Is that what Suella Braverman is truly after? An ideal society with no institutional biases and migrants enjoying the good life in Rwanda? Seems like a stretch. But remember, local elections are approaching in the UK. They're scheduled for early May. The ruling Conservative Party is trailing in opinion polls, so the Tories are trying to find ways to rally their support base. Braverman's words are being linked to this. She's been accused of dog whistling. But whatever the case may be, whatever her motivations, we say biases should not hamper justice. And we mean biases of any kind, racism or political correctness. Meanwhile, India is making a major push into Africa. India is wooing Africa, and this time with weapons. This story is about India's foray into the African arms bazaar. Last week, India invited the army chiefs of more than 30 African nations, 30 nations. The idea was to pitch made-in-India defense equipment. African military leaders got a chance to inspect Indian helicopters, drones, and artillery. And India is hoping that they'll come back as buyers. Why Africa, though? Why is India projecting itself as a defense supplier to Africa? Because there's a gap, there's a market. Africa cannot afford expensive military supplies. It wants cheap arms. And that's how India is positioning itself, a supplier that gives value for money. It's already found takers. Some African countries have started buying arms from India, like Egypt, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Mauritius, and the Seychelles. And what are they buying? We don't have the specifics, but reports say a little less than 20% of India's arms exports go to Africa. Some deliveries have been made this year, like these military trucks. They were built by India for the Royal Moroccan Army. And how many trucks did Morocco buy? Nearly 100. There's another reason why Africa is interested in Indian wares. It's because of India's collaborative approach. India is committed to not just supplying arms to Africa, it is also helping the region build its own capacities. Last week, India's Defence Minister Rajnath Singh spoke about this. He addressed the African defence chiefs and he promised support to Africa's defence industry. Let me quote from what he said. The Indian defence industry can work with you to fulfill your defence requirements with the aim to empower our African friends to indigenously meet their defence requirements. We are also committed to sharing our expertise and knowledge in defence manufacturing, research and development. What more can India offer? In recent years, India has overcome its hesitation on defence exports. In fact, it has been actively pushing made-in-India weapons like advanced towed artillery guns, the BrahMos missile, the Akash missile system, armoured vehicles and light combat helicopters, just to name a few. Recently, India has been courting Southeast Asia too. Major deals have been signed. Countries like the Philippines have bought the BrahMos missile. Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand and Myanmar have also expressed interest. Last year, reports said South Africa was also keen on buying the BrahMos. In 2022, South Africa organized the Africa Aerospace and Defence Expo. It happened in Cape Town. The makers of the BrahMos were present there. They'd set up a pavilion. So Indian defence equipment is generating a lot of interest in Africa. And this serves two purposes: defence sales for India and deeper ties with Africa, including defence ties. In fact, military drills are being stepped up. In the month of March, India hosted a major joint exercise, the Africa-India Field Training Exercise, or AF-INDEX. It was a 10-day-long exercise. Militaries of 24 African countries participated. And what did they focus on? Humanitarian mine assistance and United Nations peacekeeping operations. So India's influence in Africa is growing, although Russia still remains the dominant force in the region. Russia is the largest supplier of weapons to Africa. In sub-Saharan Africa, Russia has a 26% market share. But the war in Ukraine has distracted Russian defense contractors. They're prioritizing the Russian military, and for obvious reasons. Even deliveries to India from Russia are now running late. And this might force African militaries to look for alternatives. India is clearly at a vantage point. And this is yet another opportunity for Make in India in defense. Now let's talk about Russian President Vladimir Putin. He's been called a lot of things like paranoid, someone who has, and I'm quoting, lost touch with the world and is pathologically afraid for his life. These are the words of a former Russian officer. His name is Gleb Karakulov. He defected last year, so take his assessment with a pinch of salt. But his comments are making waves because this man was no ordinary officer. He was part of Putin's secretive elite personal security service. He was quite high up in the ranks. And he's now Russia's highest-ranking defector ever. This man has gone public. He's making some big claims. He's sharing intimate details of Vladimir Putin's life and disclosing potentially classified information. Listen to this.
Он живет в информационном коконе.
Our president is cut off from the world. He lives in an information vacuum. In the last couple of years, he spends most of his time in his residences, which media outlets very eloquently call his bunkers. He is pathologically afraid for his life. He has surrounded himself with an impenetrable barrier of quarantine and a lack of any information from the internet.
These are strong words. He also says Putin has, quote-unquote, shut himself off from the world, and there are all kinds of barriers. He quarantines himself. He's scared of COVID. And before meeting him, you have to be quarantined for at least 2 weeks. Then there is what he calls the information vacuum. Apparently, the Russian president avoids using a cell phone. He doesn't use the internet either. So what's his source of information? His inner circle and state TV news channels. That's all that he depends on, apparently. Also, his paranoia seems to have gotten worse since the war in Ukraine began. Putin now reportedly orders bomb shelters for himself.
In October, when I was in Kazakhstan, in addition to the secured phone that we had already installed in the ambassador's office, we installed another phone in a bomb shelter. To be honest, I don't understand why this was done. It is probably already an instance of some kind of paranoia.
And his so-called paranoia even involves airplanes. And we are not referring to flying anxiety, because how can we forget this? We are talking about safety issues. Vladimir Putin now travels on a special armored train. Recently, visuals of his sprawling ski lodge emerged. It's outside the city of Sochi. It boasts of a pickle pantry, a herbal sauna, and a missile defense system. You heard that right. Putin's luxury complex has its own missile defense system. Now, that's called vacationing in style. So you may agree with Karakulov when he says, and I'm quoting again, Putin's take on reality has become distorted. He's also called the president a war criminal.
I consider this man Putin a war criminal. Although I did not participate specifically in these military activities, I do not consider it possible for me to carry out his criminal orders or even to be in his service. For me, this would be too big of a deal for my conscience. I am not ready for this.
But why is this man speaking now? The defector played a crucial role on Putin's side. He was involved in encrypting the leader's communications. He accompanied him to 180 trips in the past 13 years. 180 trips. Must have been a very close aid. And now he's suddenly speaking the language of the West.
He's clearly committed war crimes. Thank you.
Holding Russian leaders to account for the atrocities they are committing in Ukraine is our collective priority.
This begs the question, is the former Putin aide now aiding the West? Because his account generally conforms with what the West has been saying. And the picture they've been trying to paint over the years, showing Vladimir Putin as once charismatic, but now growing increasingly isolated and unfit to lead a nation. Every once in a while, the Western press carries headlines and speculative stories on Putin's illness. They talk about body doubles and surgeries and Putin taking a fall. There's a lot of speculation, and a lot of it is agenda-driven. So this account could be an exaggeration, but then again, lies flourish where facts are hard to come by. Vladimir Putin has a carefully crafted image of a strong leader. He's been using the domestic press to his advantage for decades. This interview may or may not dent his image, but the details this man has shared will hurt his security for sure. So far, Russia has not commented on any of these statements. Tensions are spiraling in Israel, and this time I'm not talking about Netanyahu's judicial reform, the one that led to mass protests. I'm referring to more traditional tensions, like the divide with Palestine. Jews are celebrating the festival of Passover, and this year it coincides with the month of Ramadan. And so, what should have been a time for celebration has turned into a violent slugfest. What's worse is that this is happening at a shrine considered sacred by both Muslims and Jews, the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, the holiest site in Judaism, the third holiest in Islam. It has become a site for violent confrontation again. Israeli police raided this complex this morning. Our next report tells you why.
This is what the Al-Aqsa Mosque looked like this morning. The Israeli police entered the mosque before dawn on Wednesday. Police officers clashed with worshippers. Israel says the raid was in response to recent Palestinian rioting. An Israeli statement said the worshippers were armed with fireworks, stones and sticks. As police officials raided the mosque, fireworks were used against them. And, as is the case with all things Israeli and Palestinian, there are two versions to this story. Israel claims the worshippers were chanting violent slogans. They locked the doors of the mosque from inside and also set up fortifications and obstacles at the entrance. Israel has released footage of the aftermath of the raid. Its forces filmed the fireworks found inside the Al-Aqsa mosque. If Israeli claims are true, the worshippers have some explaining to do. For starters, why were they hoarding fireworks, stones and sticks inside the mosque? Scenes outside were just as chaotic. There was tension in the air. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is an emotive issue for Palestinians, and every time Israel raids the site, it touches a raw nerve. This is when an Israeli bus rammed into a Palestinian car. Palestinians gathered in support of the mosque and the worshippers inside it. They chanted slogans while Israeli forces set up barriers on the road. Now, the Palestinians have a different version of what happened. They say Israeli forces raided the mosque without cause and attacked innocent worshippers, leaving several injured. A Palestinian lawyer claims that Israel has detained over 500 Palestinians. Worshippers who were in the mosque when the raid occurred described what they saw.
In the yard to the eastern part of the compound, the police were firing tear gas and stun grenades. It was a scene that I can't describe. Then they stormed in and started beating everyone, and they detained people, and they put young men on their faces to the ground. They also beat them while in detention.
Palestine was joined by Saudi Arabia, Jordan and Egypt, all of whom condemned Israel's actions. Saudi Arabia went a step further. It said Israel's storming of the Al-Aqsa Mosque has undermined peace efforts, a significant setback for Israel there, considering it wants to normalize relations with Riyadh. Some groups decided to take matters into their own hands. Palestinians in the West Bank reacted furiously, and Hamas, the militant organization that controls the Gaza Strip, launched rockets at Israel. Israel responded with ground-shaking airstrikes which hit Hamas training camps and weapon depots. The Al-Aqsa Mosque has seen several violent clashes over the years. In 2021, clashes at the mosque triggered a 10-day war between Israel and Hamas. For the Palestinians, the mosque is a sign of resistance, their culture and nationhood. It's the third most sacred shrine in Islam, and Muslim worshippers aren't willing to share it.
Al-Aqsa Mosque, despite all what is going on, is purely for Muslims and cannot be shared. Everything that is going on and happening by force will never be legitimate.
Jews consider the complex one of their most sacred shrines. Ownership of the mosque remains a contentious issue, one that sparks frequent clashes. The past 1 year has been the deadliest in over 2 decades. Israeli forces have made thousands of arrests in the West Bank. Reports say at least 250 Palestinians have been killed. Meanwhile, attacks by Palestinians have killed more than 40 Israelis. The situation is volatile. They've gone to war over the Al-Aqsa Mosque before.
And while Israel and Palestine continue to fight the old fight over land, the rest of the region is clearly moving on, specifically the oil-rich Arab nations. They're resetting their politics and diversifying their economies. The Arab world has started to focus on sports. And the sports industry in this region is expected to grow by 8.7% by 2026. This is according to a new report from PwC. It says the sports sector is slowing down the world over, but West Asia will buck the global trend. Globally, the sector will grow by only 3.3% in the next 3 years. In West Asia, it may grow up to 9%. What explains this? Have people suddenly ditched fuel for football? The answer is yes. If not the people so much, at least the rulers have. They're looking at economic diversification because that's the only way forward. No matter how much oil the Gulf nations have, it is a finite resource. Eventually, even Saudi Arabia's oil wells will run dry. What happens then? That is the eventuality they're preparing for. To make sure their countries aren't left high and dry, the rulers are branching out their businesses. And driving this effort is the oil money. They have a lot of it at the moment. So they're building alternatives, investing in new industries, everything from services to IT to sports. Tonight we'll talk about sports, starting with football. Last year, Qatar became the first West Asian nation to host the World Cup. About 1.5 million fans flocked to the country, 1.5 million. Now, this is a nation with a population of just 2.7 million. So it had about 1.5 times its normal population during the tournament. Imagine what this meant for local businesses, for Qatar's tourism industry in particular. The knock-on effects of sports to tourism are huge. And that's one of the reasons why Gulf nations are investing so heavily. They're also trying to attract global talent. One of the most prominent examples is Portuguese legend Cristiano Ronaldo. He currently plays for the Saudi Arabian Football League team, Al-Nassr. Now, don't expect Ronaldo's international fans to fly into Riyadh to catch him every week, but you can bet that Saudi nationals are filling the team stadium like never before. It also sets the stage for an expansion of Saudi's local football scene. On the international stage, Gulf nations have been buying football clubs for decades. Manchester City and Newcastle in the English Premier League, Paris Saint-Germain in France. These are some of the most famous examples of Gulf-owned clubs. And this ownership helps them develop local leagues. The effort is not limited to football, though. Off-road driving events like the Dakar Rally are taking place in Saudi Arabia now. The UAE hosts the Dubai Racing World Cup, which is a premier horse racing tournament. And of course, another major sport for the region is Formula One. For over a decade, the Gulf has hosted F1 races. This year's season is already underway. Races in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia have concluded. They drew in a lot of tourists, which is partially why these countries are part of the F1 circuit. Sample this. Sports tourism gives a 30% boost to the hospitality sector. Plus, they're able to attract related businesses and industries. Case in point, Bell Racing Helmets. They've built a 60,000 square meter production facility next to the Bahrain International Circuit. This company is the world's leading manufacturer of safety helmets. Then we have a company in Abu Dhabi, an artificial intelligence company that has partnered with the Mercedes F1 team. The Emirati company is called G42. It will provide Mercedes with data-driven insights. And Saudi Arabia does not want to stop here. It wants Formula One teams to move their headquarters to the kingdom. It wants the teams to manufacture cars and train drivers on Saudi soil. Again, think of how that could boost Saudi Arabia's sports industry. Is it any wonder then that the sports sector in West Asia is thriving despite the pandemic, despite the harsh weather conditions, despite human rights concerns from the West? The Gulf sporting sector looks unlikely to slow down. Our next story is about China's threats and how they're not working. Full credits to China for continuously trying, though. Last year, it threatened the US and Taiwan over Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taipei. Pelosi landed in Taiwan anyway. And now Taiwan's president is in the United States. Tsai Ing-wen is meeting US House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. It's confirmed. And it's only befitting. China needed a dose of reality. It cannot threaten entire countries into submission. In fact, the more noise it makes, the more it gets snubbed. That's perhaps the message that Washington and Taipei have sent to Xi Jinping this time. Here's a report.
Taiwan is on a mission. Its president, Tsai Ing-wen, is on a tour of America, and the purpose of this tour is quite simple. President Tsai is demonstrating that her government has international support despite China's pressure campaign to get countries to steer clear of Taiwan. This is how President Tsai was welcomed in the United States. Tsai Ing-wen is in Los Angeles to meet US House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. There's a reason why China is so outraged. The US House Speaker is the third most powerful person in the US government after the President and the Vice President. So Tsai's meeting with Kevin McCarthy is quite significant. It's the highest level meeting with the Taiwanese president on US soil. Suddenly, Taiwan has the ear of the US's top leadership. Its president is meeting with the US House Speaker as a sovereign nation's head of state. This is a stamp of authority on Taiwan's independence, which is why China is outraged.
China firmly opposes the US arrangement for Tsai Ing-wen's transit visit and her meeting with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, the number 3 person in the US government. This act seriously violates the One China principle and the provisions of the 3 China-US joint communique and gravely undermines China's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
China also said that President Tsai and Kevin McCarthy's meeting will greatly hurt the national feelings of 1.4 billion Chinese people. China considers Taiwan its own province and President Tsai a separatist. It promises to reunify Taiwan with the Chinese mainland using force if necessary. It has become a slogan of sorts. The other slogan is this: that China will resolutely and vigorously defend national sovereignty and territorial integrity. It's basically a threat. China uses this statement to harass smaller players like Taiwan. The world saw a glimpse of this last year, right after former US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi left Taiwan. China encircled the island and conducted live fire exercises for days on end. It was simulating a potential invasion of Taiwan. China thought its show of force will discourage countries from interacting with Taiwan, but it miscalculated. The meeting between President Tsai and Speaker McCarthy was supposed to take place in Taiwan. Like his predecessor, Kevin McCarthy says he wants to visit the island. However, considering how China reacted the last time a US House Speaker was in Taiwan, both countries decided that a meeting on US soil was a better alternative. But China is still rattled, and there's no telling how it will react. Will it encircle Taiwan and fire missiles over its skies like it did last August? Last Friday, 10 Chinese warplanes crossed the median line in the Taiwan Strait. This is the de facto border that separates Taiwan and China's air defense identification zones. And on Monday, another package of 10 planes flew across the median line. So there's been a lot of activity in the Taiwan Strait. But China's attempts to stonewall the high-stakes meeting have failed. Both the US and Taiwan have defied Beijing, and the ball is now in China's court.
And now let's talk about the rising tide of global layoffs. Last year's tech-wide reckoning is not letting up, and it's going beyond big tech. You already know this. Layoffs have been making headlines every other day. Only this week, many big firms joined the tide, including UBS, with the largest job cuts globally in the past 6 months. McDonald's, Walmart, Apple, and Highland Software. In the last 6 months, more than 500,000 employees have been sacked. Some are now staging walkouts. Others are taking buyouts. It has shaken the economy, which is already under pressure from central banks and fighting a high-stakes battle with inflation. There is a sharper risk of recession, which threatens even bigger job losses. It sounds like a vicious cycle, but this is what we have. Here's a report. The rush of layoffs began late last year, and it is not willing to stop. Since October, over 500,000 workers have been sacked, with over 50,000 jobs lost in 1 week in January alone. And right now, different companies are dealing with this in different ways. Let's look at General Motors. The auto company planned to lower staff numbers in a cost-cutting effort. Now, 5,000 of their white-collar employees have taken buyouts. This can help them avoid layoffs and also save the company $1 billion every year. Meanwhile, fast food chain McDonald's has no such genius plans. It is restructuring the company, which is corporate lingo for laying off people. And they're hiding behind closed doors, literally. McDonald's closed its US offices this week while it prepares to tell employees about their fate. Employees are now working from home, waiting to know if they have been fired. But some workers elsewhere are not taking this lying down. Google plans to lay off 12,000 employees worldwide. That's about 6% of its global workforce. Now there's a dispute. Employees claim Google has rejected their proposals to reduce job cuts. And hundreds of workers have staged a walkout at the company's London offices, just like they did at the Zurich offices of Google last month.
I think what happened is not really fair. It could have happened in a different way. And it's a little bit disappointing to see a company that you believed in so much managing people like that, like handling people like that.
It's sad. I think they're missing out on some amazing brains and some amazing minds that suddenly just think, what's the point? This could be me.
It's just been a tick box exercise for the management. We told them that if they didn't fix things, they'd likely to see a lot of individual grievances, and that's happened. It's been very badly handled for a company that once had its strapline of "Don't be evil." It's been pretty evil in the way they've treated the staff. They didn't need to do this.
Layoffs are mounting across industries. The UBS Group is a recent addition. It plans to lay off 36,000 workers, making it the company with the largest job cuts globally in the past 6 months. This is coming on the heels of the Silicon Valley Bank collapse. It happened last month and sent shockwaves through the economy, which has already been shaken by mass layoffs. And UBS is one of the 760 firms who have participated in mass layoffs. As imagined, the tech sector has had the biggest losses, making up about a third of the total cuts. But the damage goes much beyond this industry. Layoffs have been seen in communications, financial, healthcare, and even real estate sectors. And this is happening at an odd time for the economy. The labor market is doing well, unemployment has stayed low, there is uncertainty over recession, but companies overhired during the pandemic, and now the people must pay for it, which leaves employees in a precarious position. Of our coworkers. And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. We're starting with India tonight. A major avalanche has struck Nathula in the northeastern state of Sikkim. 7 people have died. In Peru, many regions are hit by storms and floods. Thousands of homes have been destroyed. In Pakistan, Prime Minister Imran Khan pulled off another stunt, and this one will crack you up. He went to court wearing some very unusual headgear. Apparently a bulletproof bucket that covered his entire face. Imran Khan was visibly struggling to navigate his way, much like his political career. Full marks for creativity, though. It could make for a good Halloween costume. And finally, what happened on this day in history? Winston Churchill, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, resigned. The year was 1955. Churchill was 80 years old. He was serving his second term. He had suffered a series of strokes since 1949. His ill health forced him to step down. He was a celebrated leader in the UK, but for Indians, he was a racist white man who looked down upon people of colour and their calibre. We're leaving you with this. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Tarik baca buku.